Tuesday, April 17, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, United States. Lieutenant Keiko Yamamoto drew a sharp breath as the morning air hit her nostrils, thick with the scent of frying pork fat and something rich she couldn't immediately identify. Coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they'd choked down in field hospitals across the Pacific. Her hands trembled as she stood in the processing line with 14 other captured nurses, their torn uniforms still carrying the salt smell of the sea crossing. The aroma was so intense it made her dizzy. "It's a trick," whispered Nurse Sachiko Tanaka beside her, eyes fixed on the distant mess hall where smoke rose from kitchen chimneys. "They're trying to weaken us with their decadence." But Keiko's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. She pressed her palm against her abdomen, ashamed. Around them, American soldiers moved with casual efficiency. No brutality, no shouting, just clipboards and medical checks. One soldier, a young African-American corporal, offered a canteen of water without being asked. Keiko stared at his hand, brown-skinned and steady, remembering the propaganda films that had shown Americans as either weak-willed or savage. This man was neither. He was simply there, doing his job with quiet competence. "You'll want to drink," he said in careful, practiced Japanese. "Long journey." Keiko took the canteen. The water was clean, cold. She drank deeply, and the simple act felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been taught about the enemy. The war had taught Keiko Yamamoto many lies, though she didn't know it yet. At 26, she'd served 3 years with the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps, first in Manchuria, then in the Philippines. Daughter of a Kyoto textile merchant, she'd volunteered in 1942, driven by speeches about Japan's divine mission and the weakness of Western nations. The training had been brutal, 600 calories per day, during the final months as supplies dwindled. Instructors assured them this hardship built character, something the soft, materialistic Americans lacked entirely. The propaganda had been specific and relentless. Americans were mongrels, a mixed-race nation that would crumble under pressure. They were both decadent and cruel, obsessed with material comfort yet capable of unprecedented barbarity toward prisoners. The films showed emaciated Allied POWs, though Keiko now wondered where those images had actually come from. Her commanding officer, Captain Sato, had gathered the nurses before the Battle of Manila and delivered a speech she'd never forgotten. "If capture becomes inevitable," he'd said, voice steady, "take your own life. The Americans will violate you, torture you, parade you as trophies. Death is preferable to the humiliation awaiting women in their hands." Keiko had sewn a small blade into her uniform hem. So had Sachiko. So had all of them. When their hospital ship was bombed and they'd been pulled from the water by American sailors, Keiko had reached for that blade. A sailor had grabbed her wrist, not violently, but firmly, and removed it. "You're safe now," he'd said through an interpreter. She hadn't believed him. Her service record told a story of increasing desperation. In Manchuria, the field hospitals had operated with adequate supplies. By 1944 in the Philippines, they'd been reusing bandages washed in contaminated water. Sulfa drugs had run out entirely by January 1945. She'd watched soldiers die from infections that should have been treatable, their screams echoing through bamboo wards. A single dose of penicillin was worth more than a month's salary, but they never had penicillin. Japan didn't manufacture it. The propaganda said it was because Japanese medicine was superior, more natural. The truth was simpler. They couldn't make it. The numbers painted a starker picture than any propaganda poster. Japan's total penicillin production in 1944, 0 units. American production, 2.3 million units per month. Japanese military rations per soldier per day, 1,600 calories, mostly rice. American military rations, 4,000 calories, with meat, vegetables, and supplemental vitamins. Japanese industrial output devoted to war materials, 42%. American industrial output devoted to war materials, 40% of a vastly larger economy. Japan's entire steel production in 1944 totaled 6 million tons. America produced 80 million tons, but Keiko hadn't known these numbers. She'd only known hunger, exhaustion, and the constant assurance that sacrifice would lead to victory. The divine wind would protect Japan. American industrial might was exaggerated propaganda. Victory was inevitable for the spiritually pure. What Keiko didn't know was that within 3 hours, everything she believed about strength, sacrifice, and the nature of her enemy would begin its collapse. The smell of bacon was just the beginning. The processing building was heated. Keiko almost laughed at the absurdity. It was April, barely cool outside, and they were heating a building for prisoners. She stood in line with the other nurses waiting for medical examination. The room smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. Real disinfectant, not the watered-down solutions they'd made do with. A female American nurse, blonde and impossibly tall, gestured them forward. Through the window, Keiko watched other Japanese POWs, soldiers captured in the Philippines, walking across the compound. They weren't being marched. They were simply walking, some carrying what looked like sports equipment. One group was playing catch with a baseball. Next, the American nurse said in Japanese. Her accent was terrible, but the effort surprised Keiko. The examination was thorough and professional. Height, weight, blood pressure. The American nurse frowned at Keiko's weight, 41 kilograms, down from 53 when she'd enlisted. She made a note on her clipboard. No judgment in her expression, just clinical assessment. Malnutrition, she said. We'll get you fixed up. Then came the part that made Keiko's breath catch. The nurse opened a medical cabinet behind her, and Keiko saw the contents. Shelves upon shelves of supplies, bandages still in sterile packaging, glass vials of medication arranged in neat rows, bottles of iodine, alcohol, sulfa drugs, and there, on the second shelf, small boxes labeled with a word she recognized, penicillin, boxes of it, just sitting there, available. Her vision blurred. In 3 years of military service, Keiko had seen perhaps 5 vials of penicillin total, each one treated like the Emperor's personal treasure, reserved only for the highest-ranking officers. Here were dozens of doses in a POW camp medical station, apparently standard stock. "Are you all right?" the American nurse asked. Keiko couldn't answer. She was calculating. Each box contained 10 vials. She counted 12 boxes on that shelf alone, 120 doses. That was more penicillin than she'd seen in her entire military career, sitting in a single cabinet in a prison camp. The nurse followed her gaze and seemed to understand. She reached up and pulled down one box, opened it casually, as if it were nothing special. "We'll start you on a course of penicillin," she said. "Preventative. You've all been exposed to unsanitary conditions." "All of us?" Keiko whispered. "All of you," the nurse confirmed. "Standard protocol for new arrivals." Standard protocol. They were giving enemy prisoners, Japanese women who'd been shooting at American soldiers weeks ago, preventative penicillin as standard protocol. Keiko thought of Private Hayashi, 18 years old, who died screaming in Manila from an infected leg wound. One shot of penicillin would have saved him. They hadn't had it. These people were giving it away to their enemies. The examination continued. The American nurse checked Keiko's teeth, eyes, ears, asked about her medical history through the interpreter, made more notes. Her movements were efficient, but not rough. No contempt in her manner, no cruelty, just professional medical assessment. "You'll be assigned to Barracks 7, the nurse said. "Showers are there. Clean uniforms will be provided. Dinner is at 1700 hours. "What will we eat?" Keiko heard herself ask. The nurse looked puzzled. "Food," she said as if it were obvious. "Meat, vegetables, bread, coffee or tea. Dessert." "Dessert?" "Usually pie or cake, sometimes ice cream." Ice cream. Keiko hadn't tasted ice cream since before the war. Even then, it had been a luxury reserved for special occasions. They were feeding prisoners ice cream. The nurses walked to Barracks 7 in a tight group, silent. The compound was enormous, dozens of buildings, all well maintained. Electric lights, paved roads. In the distance, Keiko could see what looked like a baseball field and a recreation area. Japanese soldiers were playing volleyball. "This is wrong," muttered Nurse Hiromi Nakamura, the oldest of their group at 34. "It's all wrong." "It's propaganda," Sachiko insisted. "They're fattening us for something. Or they'll want information." But Keiko wasn't sure anymore. The waste of resources required for this level of deception seemed inefficient. If they wanted information, there were cheaper ways. She thought of the penicillin again. That hadn't been for show. That was just what they had available in a basic medical station. The barracks were clean. Not just clean, immaculate. Wooden floors, painted walls, windows with glass panes and curtains. 15 beds arranged in neat rows, each with a mattress, pillow, and folded blankets. In the Philippines, Keiko had slept on bamboo platforms with a single thin mat. Before capture, she'd been sleeping in a bombed-out building's basement on bare concrete. Nurse Akiko Sato, no relation to the captain, touched one of the mattresses tentatively, as if it might disappear. "It's real," she whispered. At the far end of the barracks was a room marked shower facility. They filed in slowly, expecting perhaps a single cold water spigot. Instead, they found 6 separate shower stalls, each with a curtain for privacy, hot and cold running water, soap, real soap, not the gritty lye bars they'd made in the field, shampoo, towels, clean towels, white and soft. Keiko turned on one tap. Water came out immediately, hot water, steaming. She held her hand under the stream, feeling the heat soak into her perpetually cold fingers. The last hot shower she'd had was in Kyoto, in her father's house, in 1942, 3 years ago. "I don't understand," she said aloud. No one answered because none of them understood either. The uniforms provided were simple but well made. Gray cotton shirts and pants, clean and new. Undergarments, socks without holes. Everything fit reasonably well, and if it didn't, there were multiple sizes to choose from. Multiple sizes. For prisoners. At 1700 hours, a bell rang for dinner. They followed a group of male POWs toward the mess hall, that building from which the bacon smell had originated. The sun was setting, painting the compound in orange light. Keiko noticed that the guard towers had men with rifles, but they weren't aiming at anyone. They looked almost bored. The mess hall could seat perhaps 200 people, long tables with benches. The smell hit them again as they entered. Meat, bread, something sweet. Keiko's stomach clenched painfully. At the front of the room was a serving line. American soldiers were serving food, but not as punishment or with any apparent resentment, just serving food. They joined the line. Keiko watched the man in front of her, a Japanese soldier, probably late 20s, receive his tray. The American server, a heavy-set man with a friendly face, ladled food onto the plate. A portion of roasted pork, mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, green beans, 2 slices of white bread with more butter, a cup of coffee, a piece of apple pie. The Japanese soldier stared at his tray. "This is all for me." "That's your dinner, buddy," the server said through an interpreter. "If you're still hungry after, come back for seconds. We've got plenty." Seconds. They had so much food they were offering seconds to enemy prisoners. Keiko moved forward in line. Her tray was filled with the same portions. The pork was still hot, juice pooling around it. The potatoes were real potatoes, not the sweet potato substitute they'd eaten in Japan. The bread was soft, fresh-baked that day. She could smell the yeast. She carried her tray to a table where the other nurses had gathered. They all sat in silence, staring at their food. Around them, other prisoners were eating, some hesitantly, some ravenously. No one had died. No one was sick. The food was just food. "We should eat," Hiromi said quietly. "Even if it's a trick, we need strength." Keiko picked up her fork. Actual metal fork, not bamboo chopsticks or fingers. She cut a piece of pork, lifted it to her mouth. The meat was tender, seasoned with salt and herbs she couldn't identify. Fat and protein and flavor exploded across her tongue. Her eyes watered involuntarily. In Manila, their final rations had been a cup of rice mixed with weevils and a thin miso soup. Once per day, 1,600 calories had been the goal, but by the end, they were lucky to get 1,200. Officers ate first. Medical staff ate last. She'd been hungry for so long it had become her normal state. This single piece of pork contained more nutrition than a full day's rations in the Philippines. She ate slowly, methodically, afraid that if she ate too fast, she'd be sick. The potatoes were creamy and rich. The butter was real butter, not the rancid vegetable oil they'd occasionally had. The green beans had been cooked with bacon fat. She could taste it. Even the vegetables were luxurious. Halfway through the meal, she started to cry. Silent tears running down her face as she chewed white bread that dissolved in her mouth like a sweet cloud. She couldn't stop herself. Sachiko was crying too. So was Akiko. They weren't crying from sadness or fear. They were crying because the contrast was too great, because this enemy had taken better care of them in one day than their own army had in the final 6 months of their service. The coffee was real coffee, strong and bitter and wonderful. Keiko wrapped her hands around the warm cup and understood for the first time that Japan was going to lose this war, had perhaps already lost it, because you couldn't defeat a nation that fed its prisoners better than Japan fed its frontline soldiers. You couldn't overcome an enemy that wasted more resources on POW camps than your entire military had available for active operations. The numbers were beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. Not the propaganda numbers, but the real ones she was witnessing. The abundance wasn't a trick. It was just their baseline normal. After dinner, there was pie. Apple pie with a flaky crust, the apples soft and sweet with cinnamon. Keiko ate hers slowly, making it last, trying to memorize the taste. When was the last time she'd had dessert? When had any of them? "This is what they have," Hiromi said quietly. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. "This is just their normal. They're not trying to impress us. This is what they always have." The weight of that realization settled over their table like fog. If this was normal for a prison camp, what did their actual soldiers eat? Their civilians. And if they could afford this for their enemies, what did that say about the industrial capacity they'd been told was exaggerated propaganda? Keiko thought of Captain Sato's speech about American weakness and decadence. She looked around the mess hall at the other prisoners, men who'd been captured weeks or months ago. They looked healthy. Some had gained weight. Their skin had color. No one bore marks of beating or torture. They were just eating dinner in a heated building, with electric lights, with coffee and pie. The decadent nation that should have collapsed under Japanese spiritual superiority was feeding its enemies better than Japan fed its own. That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket, Keiko couldn't sleep. Her stomach was uncomfortably full. She'd eaten too much, too quickly, after months of near starvation. But it wasn't the physical discomfort keeping her awake. It was the cognitive dissonance. Everything she'd been taught said this shouldn't exist. The Americans were supposed to be weak, desperate, running out of resources. But the evidence surrounding her told a different story entirely. She tried to reconcile what she'd believed with what she'd witnessed, and found she couldn't make them fit. In the darkness, she heard Sachiko whisper, "I don't know what to think anymore." "Neither do I," Keiko admitted. Across the barracks, someone was crying quietly, not from sadness, from confusion, from the psychological whiplash of having your entire worldview shattered in a single day. The next morning began with breakfast. More food than Keiko had eaten in the past 3 months combined. Eggs. Actual eggs, not the powdered substitute. Bacon, toast with jam, orange juice. The mess hall served it buffet style, and prisoners could take as much as they wanted. Some of the longer-term POWs were casual about it, as if this abundance was normal, which Keiko was beginning to understand. It was for them. After breakfast, they had medical examinations, more thorough this time. A doctor, a middle-aged American man with kind eyes, examined each nurse individually. He spoke through an interpreter, a Japanese-American woman named Amy, who'd been raised in California. "Your malnutrition is severe," the doctor told Keiko. "We'll be starting you on a high-calorie diet with vitamin supplements. B-complex, vitamin C, iron. Your blood work shows anemia." Blood work. They'd taken blood samples yesterday and already had results. In the Philippines, they hadn't had the equipment for blood work. Soldiers had died from transfusion reactions because they couldn't type blood reliably. "How long until I'm healthy?" Keiko asked. "With proper nutrition, probably 6 to 8 weeks to restore your weight, longer to fully recover from the nutritional deficits. But you'll start feeling better within days." 6 to 8 weeks. He was talking about her recovery as if it were guaranteed, as if they had all the time and resources in the world to rehabilitate enemy prisoners. The doctor made notes on her chart with a fountain pen. A nice one, casual, not a precious resource to be guarded. In her unit, they'd shared 3 pencils among 30 staff. The medical facility was adjacent to the barracks. Keiko was sent there the next day when she developed a fever, her body fighting off infections that had been suppressed by malnutrition. The infirmary was shocking in its completeness. 16 beds, X-ray equipment, a small operating theater, cabinets full of medications and supplies. An American nurse, African-American woman named Lieutenant Sarah Williams, supervised with quiet competence. "Pneumonia," Lieutenant Williams said after examining Keiko. "Mild, but we'll treat it aggressively." She administered penicillin without fanfare, just inserted the needle, injected the dose, marked it on a chart. The casual waste of this miracle drug made Keiko's head spin. In Manila, they'd have used this dose on a colonel at minimum. Here, it was given to an enemy prisoner for mild pneumonia. "You'll be in bed for 3 days," Lieutenant Williams said. "Rest, fluids, antibiotics. You'll be fine." 3 days later, Keiko was fine. The infection cleared completely. She'd never seen someone recover from pneumonia so quickly. Without penicillin, it would have taken weeks, if she'd survived at all. In the infirmary, she'd watched Lieutenant Williams work. The nurse moved with practiced efficiency, caring for Japanese prisoners with the same attention she gave to an American orderly who'd cut his hand. No difference in treatment, no visible resentment, just professional medical care. "Why?" Keiko asked one day. "Why do you take care of us like this?" Lieutenant Williams looked up from the chart she was updating. "Because you're patients," she said simply. "That's what nurses do. But we're your enemies. You're prisoners. The war is over for you. Now you're just people who need medical care." She paused, then added, "Besides, there are international rules. Geneva Convention. We follow them." Geneva Convention. Keiko had heard of it, but never understood its practical implications. It was a set of rules about how to treat prisoners, and these people actually followed them, not because they had to, who would punish America if they didn't, but because they chose to. During her week of recovery, Keiko observed other aspects of camp life. Education classes were offered. Japanese prisoners could learn English if they wanted. There was a library with books in Japanese and English, a recreation yard with sports equipment. Letters home were permitted, though censored. Once per week, they could write to their families. The first time Keiko held the paper and pencil provided for letter writing, she didn't know what to say. How could she explain this to her mother? How could she describe living better as a prisoner than she had as a soldier? She wrote carefully, "Dear Mother, I am well. I am being treated fairly. There is enough food. Please do not worry about me. I hope you and Father are safe. Your daughter, Keiko." Censored though it would be, even those simple statements would tell her mother more than the propaganda allowed. If the letter made it through, her mother would know she was alive and not being tortured. That seemed worth the effort. Weeks turned into a month. The routine of camp life became familiar. 3 meals per day, every day. Medical care when needed. Clean clothes, heated buildings, electric lights. The abundance that had shocked them initially became the new normal, but the psychological impact didn't fade. It deepened. Letters from home started arriving. Heavily censored, but they came. Keiko received one from her mother in late May. It had taken 6 weeks to arrive, passed through military channels and multiple censor reviews. "Dearest Keiko," it began. "We were overjoyed to learn you are alive. The authorities told us your ship was lost. We had given up hope. Food is very scarce here. Your father's shop is closed. There is no fabric to sell. We eat once per day, mostly vegetables and small amounts of rice. Many people are hungry. The city was bombed again last week. The Tanaka family's house was destroyed. We are surviving in the basement when the air raids come. Please write again if you can. We think of you constantly. Mother." Keiko read the letter 3 times, then sat on her bunk and cried. Not quietly this time. She sobbed, shoulders shaking, while the other nurses pretended not to notice. Her parents were starving in the basement of their own home, while she ate 3 full meals per day. Her mother's shop was destroyed while she slept in a clean, warm bed. Her family huddled in darkness during air raids while she had electric lights and safety. The guilt was crushing. "They're suffering," she said when she could speak again. "And I'm living better here than I ever did in the army. Better than I lived at home in the last 2 years." Sachiko had received a similar letter. Her family in Tokyo was evacuating to the countryside to escape the bombings. They had nothing. No food security, no medical care, no safety. "We're the lucky ones," Sachiko said bitterly. "That's what's unbearable. Getting captured by the enemy was the best thing that could have happened to us. We're healthier, safer, better fed as POWs than our families are as free citizens." It was true. Objectively, mathematically true. And it revealed something they'd all been avoiding thinking about directly. Japan was dying, not just losing the war, but experiencing complete societal collapse. The industrial capacity, the resources, the food, everything they'd been promised was winning the war. It didn't exist. It had never existed. The whole thing had been a lie built on lies. In early June, news reached the camp that Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The European war was over. The male POWs who'd been captured earlier had access to newspapers, censored but informative, and they shared the news. Japan now stood alone against the combined might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The nurses gathered in their barracks to discuss it. 15 women who'd believed absolutely in Japan's divine protection and inevitable victory, now facing the mathematical impossibility of their situation. How long? Hiromi asked. How long until Japan surrenders? No one wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew. Weeks, maybe months if the military leadership was stubborn, but the war was over. Japan had lost. They'd probably lost it in 1942, but the propaganda machine had hidden the truth so effectively that millions of people had died for a cause already decided. My brother is in Okinawa, Akiko said quietly. At least he was last time we heard. The Americans are probably there by now. They were. They all knew it. The American industrial machine that could feed prisoners apple pie was now turning toward Japan's home islands with its full attention. What would that look like? What would happen to their families? We have to tell them, Keiko said suddenly. When the war ends, when we go home, we have to tell them the truth. Tell them what? Sachiko asked. That we were treated well. They'll think we're traitors. Collaborators. Tell them that we lost because we never had a chance, Keiko said. Tell them about the food, the medicine, the resources. Tell them that America's prison camps are better equipped than Japan's frontline military hospitals. Tell them the truth so no one can lie about it later. It was a dangerous idea. In post-war Japan, with shame and defeat raw, speaking favorably about the enemy would carry risks. But it was also necessary. Someone had to witness what they'd seen. Someone had to remember that the propaganda had been lies, built on lies. They didn't formally agree to it that night, but a silent understanding passed between them. They would remember, they would tell the truth when it was safe to do so. The summer passed slowly. News of Japan's situation filtered into the camp through carefully controlled channels. The firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japanese cities, the loss of Okinawa. Each piece of news made the inevitable conclusion more apparent. In July, Lieutenant Williams, the African-American nurse who'd treated Keiko's pneumonia, sat with her during a routine medical checkup. They'd developed a cautious rapport over the weeks. Williams was professional but not cold. She sometimes asked Keiko about Japanese culture, seemingly genuinely interested. "Can I ask you something?" Keiko said during one of these conversations. "Personal question." "Go ahead." "You're Negro, yes?" It was the Japanese word for Black Americans, not meant cruelly, but simply descriptively. "African American, yes." In Japan, they told us that Negro soldiers were treated badly, that America was divided, weak because of racial conflict. They said your people were oppressed. William's expression was complicated. "They weren't entirely wrong," she said after a moment. "There is racial discrimination in America, legal segregation in many states. I can't eat in certain restaurants back home, can't stay in certain hotels. The Army itself is segregated. Black soldiers serve in separate units." "Oh," Keiko felt confused. "But you're an officer. You have authority here." "In the Army, yes. In this context. But that doesn't mean America is perfect." Williams met her eyes directly. "Your propaganda took a real problem and exaggerated it. Yes, America has racial issues, but it's not weak because of diversity. It's stronger because of it. We're fighting to make it better, to make it live up to its own ideals. That's different from a nation that demands conformity and crushes dissent." It was a nuanced answer that didn't fit neatly into either the propaganda narrative or its complete opposite. America wasn't perfect, but it was self-aware enough to acknowledge its problems and wealthy enough that even with those problems, it could still produce more, feed more, and care for more people, including its enemies, than Japan could manage for its own citizens. "Thank you for being honest," Keiko said. "Thank you for asking," Williams replied. "It's nice to be asked, rather than having people just assume." That conversation stayed with Keiko. The ability to have it, to discuss controversial topics with an enemy officer to receive honest answers, was itself evidence of a kind of strength Japan had never possessed. Strength wasn't just industrial output and military might. It was also the confidence to admit imperfection. On August 6th, something happened that the American guards wouldn't discuss directly, but rumors spread through the camp. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city, Hiroshima. The prisoners heard whispers but couldn't confirm details. Then, 3 days later, another city, Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the Japanese people for the first time in history. His voice, broadcast through the camp's loudspeakers, announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The nurses gathered in their barracks, listening to the emperor's carefully worded speech about enduring the unendurable. When it finished, they sat in silence. No one celebrated. No one cried. They were simply done. The thing they'd feared and expected had finally happened. "We can go home," Akiko said eventually. "What home?" Sachiko responded. "Have you read your letters? There's nothing left to go home to." It was harsh, but accurate. Their families were alive, mostly, but Japan itself was destroyed. Burned cities, starving people, complete industrial collapse. What would they find when they returned? "We're still luckier than most," Hiromi said quietly. "We survived. We're healthy. We have information about how the world actually works. That's more than most of our people have." Repatriation took months. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners from locations across the Pacific were complex. Keiko's group remained at Camp McCoy until November, continuing to receive the same treatment as before. No change in conditions despite the war's end. No revenge or retribution, just continued adherence to the rules they'd always followed. In October, Lieutenant Williams gave Keiko a small package. Inside was a basic medical kit. Bandages, antiseptic, aspirin, a few doses of penicillin. "For your journey home," Williams said. "Things are difficult in Japan right now. This might help." "I can't accept this," Keiko protested. "It's too much." "Consider it a gift between nurses," Williams said. "We take care of people. All people. That doesn't stop just because the war is over." Keiko took the kit. She tried to thank Williams properly, but the English words didn't come. She bowed deeply instead, in the formal Japanese style she hadn't used since before the war. Williams returned the bow, not quite correctly, but with sincere respect. Be safe," Williams said, "and help your people recover. They're going to need it." The journey back to Japan was long and uncomfortable. Crowded ships, minimal provisions compared to what they'd become accustomed to. When they landed in Yokohama in December 1945, Keiko barely recognized her homeland. The destruction was incomprehensible. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble. People dressed in rags, many visibly starving. Children begging for food. The smell of poverty and desperation hung over everything. After 8 months of adequate nutrition, Keiko felt obscenely healthy compared to her countrymen. Her parents wept when they saw her. She'd gained 12 kilograms during her captivity. Her skin was clear, her hair was healthy, she had color in her cheeks. Standing next to her mother, gaunt, aged 10 years in appearance, the contrast was grotesque. "You look well," her mother said, voice breaking. "I was treated fairly," Keiko replied carefully. "Better than I deserved." She didn't elaborate, not yet. The shame of losing the war was too raw. People were committing suicide rather than face defeat. Speaking positively about American treatment would be seen as collaboration, possibly treason. So she kept quiet and focused on helping her family survive. The medical kit from Lieutenant Williams saved 3 lives that winter. A neighbor's child with an infected wound. Keiko used the penicillin. An elderly man with a fever. The aspirin brought it down. A woman who'd cut herself on rubble. The antiseptic prevented infection. Each time, Keiko remembered the cabinet in the POW camp infirmary, stocked with these supplies as basic inventory. In 1946, she found work with the occupation forces as a medical translator. The American military had moved into Japan, bringing their supplies and organization. Keiko watched them set up hospitals, distribute food, implement public health programs. She watched them try to rebuild what the war had destroyed. It wasn't perfect. There were problems, resentments, cultural clashes, but it was effective. Working alongside American medical staff, she saw the same patterns she'd observed at Camp McCoy. Abundance of supplies, efficient systems, treatment based on medical need rather than social rank. It was strange and sometimes uncomfortable, but it worked. People received care. Slowly, Japan began to recover. She didn't speak publicly about her experiences until 1965. By then, Japan had rebuilt itself into an economic power. The shame of defeat had faded enough that people could discuss the war with some objectivity. A historian interviewing former POWs asked her about Camp McCoy. "It was the most disorienting experience of my life," she told him. "Everything I'd been taught about the enemy was wrong. Not just exaggerated, completely wrong. They weren't weak. They weren't cruel. They had more resources than I'd imagined possible. And they treated us according to rules, even though they didn't have to." "Did you resent them for that?" the historian asked. Keiko considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I resented the people who'd lied to us, who told us we were winning when we'd already lost, who'd sent us to fight a war we could never win. The Americans were just doing what they always did, taking care of people, following their systems. That was their normal." She paused, remembering the smell of bacon that first morning, the weight of the penicillin box in her hands, Lieutenant Williams' kind professionalism. "The thing that broke me wasn't their cruelty," she continued. "It was their abundance. It was realizing that their prison camps were better equipped than our frontline hospitals. That said more about our situation than any battle report. You can't beat an enemy that treats its prisoners better than you treat your own soldiers, not with spiritual strength or divine wind or propaganda." The numbers told the truth, even when our leaders wouldn't. The historian published her account in a collection of POW testimonies that year. It sold modestly but earned respect for its honesty. Other nurses from her group contributed their stories as well. Sachiko wrote about the psychological impact of living better as a prisoner than as a soldier. Hiromi described the guilt of being healthy while her family starved. Together, their accounts painted a picture of war that Japanese textbooks had avoided, a picture of complete industrial mismatch disguised by effective propaganda. In 1972, Keiko traveled back to the United States for the first time since repatriation, a medical conference in San Francisco. She was 53 then, a respected hospital administrator in Tokyo. The conference organizers had arranged for former POWs to reunite with camp staff if they wished. Keiko had written ahead, asking if Lieutenant Sarah Williams might be located. They found her. Williams had retired from the Army in 1953, worked as a civilian nurse in Chicago for 20 years, and was now teaching at a nursing school. She agreed to meet Keiko at the conference. The two women sat in a hotel restaurant, both older and grayer, separated by language barriers that required a translator but united by shared memories of a strange time. "I never properly thanked you," Keiko said through the interpreter, "for treating me like a person when you could have treated me like an enemy." Williams smiled. "I never thought of you as an enemy," she said. "You were a nurse who'd gotten caught up in a terrible war. Same as me, really. Different uniform, same profession." "The medical kit you gave me saved lives," Keiko continued. 3 people in my neighborhood that winter. I've wanted to tell you that for 27 years." Williams's eyes grew bright. "That's the best thing anyone's ever told me," she said quietly. "That's what it's supposed to be about, helping people. All people." They talked for 2 hours about their lives, their work, the changes in their countries. Williams had lived through the civil rights movement, seen legal segregation end, watched America struggle with its racial demons. Keiko had witnessed Japan's transformation from defeated nation to economic powerhouse. Both had complicated feelings about their homelands, love mixed with critical awareness of flaws. "Do you think it was worth it?" Keiko asked. "The war, I mean. All that death and destruction. Was there meaning in it?" Williams took a long time to answer. "I don't know if wars have meaning," she said finally, "but I think people can find meaning in how they act during impossible situations. You and I, we took care of people. That mattered. That was real, even when everything else was insane." It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was an honest one. Keiko appreciated that. They parted with promises to write, promises both kept for the next 18 years until Williams died in 1990. By the 1980s, Keiko had become something of a minor public figure in Japan. She gave lectures about wartime medical care, about propaganda and reality, about the importance of international cooperation. She'd married in 1950, had 3 children, 6 grandchildren. She'd lived to see Japan become one of the world's wealthiest nations, its former enemy, its closest ally. In 1988, a television documentary about Japanese-American reconciliation interviewed her. The interviewer asked the question everyone always asked, "What was the moment you knew Japan would lose?" Keiko smiled. "The bacon," she said. "The very first morning at Camp McCoy, I smelled bacon frying, real coffee brewing. I saw American soldiers eating breakfast casually, wasting food without thinking about it. And I thought, we've lost. We're fighting people who can afford to waste more than we have total. The war was over. We just didn't know it yet." The documentary showed footage of modern Japan, bustling Tokyo, efficient bullet trains, prosperous citizens. Then it cut back to Keiko, elderly but sharp-eyed. "The lesson wasn't that America was perfect," she said to the camera. "It was that they had the capacity to be humane, even to their enemies. That's real strength, not cruelty, not propaganda, not forcing people to believe comfortable lies. Real strength is being able to treat your prisoners better than circumstances require, simply because you have the resources and the values to do so." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Japan learned that lesson the hard way. We learned that a nation's power isn't just military, it's industrial, yes, but also moral. It's the ability to maintain your humanity when you don't have to. America could have treated us terribly. We expected them to. Instead, they followed their rules. That shook me more than any battle could have. The interviewer asked one final question. If you could tell your younger self, the nurse who arrived at Camp McCoy in 1945, one thing, what would it be? Keiko thought about that 26-year-old woman stepping off the transport, terrified and indoctrinated, preparing for horrors that never came. "I would tell her," Keiko said slowly, "that everything she thinks she knows is wrong. And that's okay. Being wrong means you can learn something true. The bacon isn't a trick. The medicine isn't propaganda. The kindness isn't weakness. It's all real, and it's going to teach you things your own leaders couldn't or wouldn't tell you. Pay attention. Remember everything, because someday you'll need to tell this story so that others can learn without having to lose a war first." The documentary aired in March 1988. It won several awards. More importantly, it sparked conversations in Japanese households about the war, about propaganda, about the dangers of believing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Keiko Yamamoto died in 1996 at the age of 77. Her obituary in the Asahi Shimbun noted her wartime service, her work in post-war reconstruction, her contributions to nursing education. But it was a smaller detail that perhaps mattered most. She'd kept for 51 years a small, empty penicillin vial from Camp McCoy. When her daughter found it while sorting through her mother's belongings, there was a note attached in Keiko's handwriting. "This vial was once full of medicine more valuable than gold. An enemy nurse gave it to me. I used it to save a neighbor's child. Remember, the measure of a nation isn't how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies when no one is watching." KY, 1965. Her daughter donated the vial and note to the Japanese War Museum in Tokyo. It sits there now in a small display about POW experiences, alongside Keiko's testimony and photographs from Camp McCoy. Thousands of visitors see it each year. A small glass vial that once contained a miracle drug, now containing only air and memory. But what it really contains is a lesson that Keiko spent half her life trying to teach. That strength without humanity is brutality. That propaganda withers in the face of lived experience, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but simply treating others with dignity they don't expect. The smell of bacon on that April morning in 1945 had been more than breakfast. It had been evidence. Evidence that everything she'd been taught was a lie. Evidence that her enemy possessed resources and values her own nation had lacked. Evidence that the war was already lost, had perhaps been lost from the start. Keiko never forgot that smell. Even decades later, when she could afford any breakfast she wanted, when Japan had rebuilt itself into prosperity, she remembered standing in line at Camp McCoy, inhaling the aroma of abundance, feeling her worldview crack and crumble. That moment of cognitive dissonance had been painful, terrifying even, but it had also been the moment she started understanding the truth. And in the end, painful truth had proven far more valuable than comfortable lies. The bacon had been real. The medicine had been real, the kindness had been real, and those realities had taught her more about the nature of power than 1,000 propaganda films ever could. Years later, she would tell her grandchildren, "The most important thing I learned in the war wasn't how to treat wounds or follow orders. It was how to recognize truth, even when it contradicts everything you want to believe. That lesson saved my life more than the food or medicine ever did. Because once you see the truth, you can never completely unsee it, and that's uncomfortable. But it's also freedom.